She came to the Miller house with a reason she kept locked behind her ribs. A quiet promise, a name on an old letter, a wound that never healed. But inside that home, with a widower who doesn't know how to breathe again, and a little girl who watches everything, Sophie begins to realize that revenge is easy, until she discovers some things that shake her to the core. Before we begin, subscribing is a simple way to support this space as it grows toward its first 1,000 subscribers, and we can keep sharing stories like this. Thank you so much for being in here. Now, let's begin. You're early. Andrew Miller didn't open the door wide, not in a rude way, in a careful way, like space mattered, like thresholds had rules. Sophie Carter held his gaze with a calm that wasn't natural. It was practiced. "I've never had a good relationship with being late," Sophie said. Andrew blinked once as if he hadn't expected an answer that sounded like a confession. "Most people would say traffic," he replied. Sophie's mouth curved slightly. "Traffic never ruined my life." Andrew's eyes narrowed a fraction. Not suspicion. Recognition. The kind that said, that line came from somewhere. From inside the hallway, a small voice floated toward them. "Dad?" Andrew didn't take his eyes off Sophie. "I'm here, Em." A little girl appeared behind him, hair still damp, like she'd just decided brushing wasn't worth the effort. She was holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear, the way kids held the things that made them feel safe, casually, but never far. Emma Miller looked at Sophie the way a judge looks at a witness. "You're the new nanny?" Emma asked. Sophie lowered herself slightly, not to charm, but to meet her honestly. "I'm Sophie." Emma stared. "Do you know how to make pancakes?" Andrew cleared his throat. "Emma, it's a fair question," Sophie said calmly. Andrew's gaze flicked to her. Sophie looked at Emma. "Yes." Emma's eyes narrowed. "Real pancakes or healthy pancakes?" Sophie held the pause like it mattered. "Real." Emma's face didn't smile, but something softened, like a door unlatched one notch. Andrew's shoulders loosened. It was small, almost invisible. But Sophie noticed everything that mattered. Emma took one step closer. "Do you leave?" Andrew's jaw tightened. "Emma?" Sophie didn't look at Andrew. She looked at Emma. "I don't plan to," Sophie said gently, "but I'll always tell you the truth." Emma studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, like an adult signing a document. Andrew's voice was quieter when he said, "Come in." Sophie stepped inside, the warmth of the house wrapping around her like a question. It was a nice home, not flashy. Comfortable in a way that didn't try to convince anyone of anything. A house that had been built for a family. A family that had been broken. On the wall near the staircase, framed photos, Emma at different ages, Andrew beside a woman with bright eyes and a smile that looked like sunlight. Sophie didn't stare, but she saw her. The wife, the mother, the absence. Andrew cleared his throat again. "The kitchen's this way." Emma marched ahead like a tiny escort with authority. Sophie followed, her bag strapped tight in her fingers. This was the moment she'd imagined for years. Walking into the life of the man who had made her father's life collapse. And he looked normal. Tired. Controlled. Quiet. Not monstrous. Which was somehow worse. Emma climbed onto a chair at the kitchen island and pointed at the countertop. "Sit." Sophie sat. Andrew leaned against the counter across from her, arms crossed. The posture of someone who didn't know how to relax when another adult was in his space. "I read your resume," Andrew said. Sophie nodded. "I read your listing." Andrew's brows lifted slightly. "And?" Sophie met his eyes. "You were honest." Andrew let out a slow breath. "That's a rare compliment." Emma swung her legs. "Dad's honest, but annoying." Andrew glanced at her. "Emma?" Emma shrugged. "It's true." Sophie's lips twitched. She fought the smile and lost. Andrew saw it. "You find that funny." Sophie kept her tone even. "I find her accurate." Emma looked pleased. "See? Sophie gets it." Andrew looked at Sophie again, and for a second something almost like amusement lived in his eyes. Then it disappeared. "I should explain the schedule," he said. Sophie nodded, ready. Andrew slid a paper across the counter, typed, detailed, too detailed. Sophie scanned it. "Breakfast at 7:10, shoes at 7:32, backpack check." A note. "Emma doesn't like surprise changes." Sophie looked up. "You wrote this yourself." Andrew's jaw tightened slightly as if he were bracing for judgment. "Yes," Sophie asked softly. "Why so specific?" Andrew's eyes flicked to Emma. Emma answered for him. "Because if things change, my stomach hurts." Andrew's face didn't move, but something behind it did. Sophie's voice gentled. "I understand." Andrew watched her closely. "Do you?" Sophie swallowed the truth she almost said. "Yes, because I watched my own father fall apart, and I learned to predict pain before it arrived." Instead, she said, "Children like consistency. Adults, too." Andrew looked down at the paper, then back up. "Most people don't say that out loud." Emma leaned forward. "Most people lie." Andrew exhaled. "Emma." Emma's eyes stayed on Sophie. "Are you going to lie?" Sophie met her gaze. "I'm going to be kind." Emma frowned. "That's not an answer." Sophie nodded once, like Emma had said something important. "You're right." Andrew's eyes narrowed slightly again. "Most adults would be offended." Sophie shrugged. "Most adults are fragile." Emma pointed at Andrew. "Dad is fragile." Andrew's mouth opened, then closed. Sophie heard the almost laugh trapped in his throat. She decided to make it worse. "You don't look fragile," Sophie said to Andrew, calm as anything. "You look like someone who's holding his breath on purpose." Andrew froze. Emma blinked. "Dad does that." Andrew's gaze held Sophie's. A beat. 2 beats. Then Andrew looked away first. "I have to take a call," he said abruptly. "Work." Emma rolled her eyes. "Work is always stealing him." Andrew's voice was gentle, but firm. "Emma." Sophie stood. "I can show Emma around while you take it." Andrew hesitated. "You don't need to." "I'd like to," Sophie said. Andrew's gaze lingered. Then he nodded. "Okay." Emma hopped down from her chair and grabbed Sophie's hand without asking, as if she'd just decided Sophie belonged in the house now. Sophie's fingers tightened around Emma's small hand. A tiny, dangerous warmth bloomed in her chest. Emma pulled her toward the hallway. "This is the living room." Sophie followed. "This is where Dad stares," Emma said, pointing to a chair by the window. Sophie paused. "He stares?" Emma nodded. "He stares like he's thinking too loud." Sophie looked at the chair, the window, the quiet. She could imagine it too easily. Emma pointed at the mantel. "That's Mom." Sophie's throat tightened. She kept her face calm. A photo of a woman, soft eyes, bright smile, the kind of warmth that made you believe homes could heal people. Emma stared at the photo without blinking. "She was funny," Emma said, voice small. "She used to make Dad dance when he didn't want to." Sophie glanced toward the hallway where Andrew's voice had disappeared. "Does he dance now?" Sophie asked softly. Emma's lips pressed together. "No." Sophie nodded. Emma looked up at her suddenly. "Do you dance?" Sophie almost laughed. "Not well." Emma's eyes narrowed. "Dad doesn't dance either." Sophie's mouth curved slightly. "Then maybe we'll both be forced to." Emma considered that. "Good." They walked upstairs. Emma showed her the bathroom, her room, her closet. "This is where I hide," Emma said matter-of-factly, pointing to a corner behind a chair. Sophie crouched. "When?" Emma's voice dropped. "When Dad gets quiet." Sophie's heart tightened again. Emma looked at her carefully. "Sometimes he thinks I don't notice, but I do." Sophie felt the weight of that statement settle in her bones. Emma wasn't just a child. She was a child who had learned to watch adults for survival. Sophie knew that kind of watching, because she had done it too. Emma pulled a notebook from under her pillow and opened it, drawings, stars, a planet with rings, and a stick-figure family. A woman was crossed out, but not angry crossed out. Gentle, like someone had tried to erase without destroying. Sophie's chest hurt. Emma pointed to the stick-figure dad. "That's Dad." She pointed to the little stick-figure girl. "That's me." Then she pointed to an empty space beside them. "I left that blank," Emma whispered, "because Dad said we can't replace Mom." Sophie swallowed. "He's right." Emma looked up. "So who goes there?" Sophie held Emma's gaze, and for the first time Sophie felt the full cruelty of her plan. She had come here to hurt Andrew Miller. And the person who would bleed first was a little girl holding a stuffed rabbit and an empty space in her drawing. Downstairs, Andrew's voice carried through the hall, low and controlled. Sophie couldn't hear the words, but she could hear the tone, the kind of tone that kept the world out, the kind of tone her own father had used when he was pretending everything was fine. Emma whispered, "He's on the phone." Sophie nodded. Emma asked, "Is your dad loud?" Sophie froze. Emma's eyes stayed on her, too observant. Sophie forced her voice steady. "He used to be." Emma nodded slowly, like that made sense in a way she didn't want it to. Sophie stood and smoothed Emma's bedspread, buying herself a second to breathe. Emma touched Sophie's sleeve. "If you leave, tell me first." Sophie looked down at her. Emma's eyes were too big with trust that hadn't been earned yet. Sophie's throat tightened. "I will," Sophie whispered. Emma held her gaze. "Promise?" Sophie nodded once. "I promise." As they walked back downstairs, Sophie's phone buzzed in her bag. A message, one name on the screen, Dad. Sophie's breath caught. She didn't open it, not yet. Because if she read his words, she might remember why she'd come. And right now, in this house, with this child's hand still warm in hers, forgetting felt dangerously easy. Andrew ended his call as they stepped into the kitchen. He looked up, and his gaze landed on Emma's hand in Sophie's. Something flickered across his face, not jealousy, relief, like Emma had smiled without him noticing, and the world had quietly given him something back. Emma announced, "Sophie knows where I hide." Andrew's eyes widened slightly. "You showed her?" Emma nodded. She didn't laugh. Andrew's gaze moved to Sophie. "Did she?" Sophie shook her head. "No." Andrew's voice softened. "Thank you." Sophie nodded, unable to trust her own voice. Andrew looked at the clock. "I have to leave for work in 10 minutes." Emma's shoulders dropped. Andrew noticed immediately. He crouched in front of her. "Hey," Emma's mouth tightened. "Work steals you." Andrew's voice lowered. "I'll be back." Emma didn't look convinced. Sophie watched the way Andrew stayed there, patient, waiting for Emma's eyes to meet his. "Emma," Andrew said softly, "look at me." Emma did. Andrew's voice was simple. "I'm not leaving you." Emma's eyes shimmered. Sophie's heart tightened again. Andrew added quieter, "Not ever." Emma nodded once, like she was forcing herself to believe. Then Emma looked at Sophie, as if asking, "Do you believe him?" Sophie didn't know what to do with that. So she did the only honest thing. She said softly, "He means it." Andrew's gaze snapped to hers, a beat. Then he stood. "I'll be back at 5, Andrew said. "Dinner is in the fridge. Emma will tell you the rules." Emma lifted her chin. "There are many." Andrew's mouth twitched. "I'm sure." He grabbed his coat, then paused at the doorway. He looked back at Sophie. His voice was careful. "If you need anything to call me." Sophie nodded. "Okay." Andrew hesitated, like he wanted to say something else. Then he left. The door clicked shut, and the house went quiet again. Emma stood at the kitchen island, tapping her fingers. "What's Rule 1?" Sophie asked gently. Emma's eyes narrowed in thought. "Rule 1," Emma said, "is no healthy pancakes." Sophie nodded solemnly. "Understood." Emma pointed at her. "And Rule 2." Sophie waited. Emma's voice dropped to a whisper. "Don't make Dad sad." Sophie's chest tightened. She looked at the door Andrew had walked through, then back at Emma. Sophie forced a soft smile. "Okay," she said. But inside, her mind whispered the truth like a threat. "I came here to do exactly that." And for the first time, Sophie wasn't sure she could. Sophie learned the rules quickly, not because Emma explained them, because the house did. The house spoke in pauses, in the way Emma checked Andrew's face before speaking, in the way Andrew lowered his voice whenever Emma entered a room, like volume itself could be dangerous. Rule 3 revealed itself at lunch. Emma pushed her plate away after 3 bites. "I'm not hungry." Sophie glanced at the clock. Exactly 12 minutes after Andrew had left. She didn't argue. She didn't insist. She asked, "Is it a stomach not hungry or a heart not hungry?" Emma's eyebrows pulled together. "There are different kinds," Sophie nodded. "Very different." Emma considered this, then slid the plate back an inch. "It's heart." Sophie sat across from her instead of standing over her. "Do you want to talk or be quiet?" Emma shrugged. "Quiet first." So Sophie stayed quiet. She washed dishes slowly. Let the silence exist without trying to fix it. Emma swung her legs and watched the rabbit fall off the chair and picked it up without comment. After a while, Emma spoke again, like the silence had done its job. "Dad used to sing." Sophie didn't look up. "Used to." Emma nodded. "In the car, bad songs, loud." Sophie smiled faintly. "Those are usually the best ones." Emma's mouth curved, then flattened again. "He stopped?" Sophie dried her hands and sat back down. "When?" Emma stared at the table. "When Mom got sick." There it was, not death, the before. Sophie felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the one that always came before memory. "My dad stopped laughing," Sophie said softly, surprising herself, "before everything ended." Emma looked up. "Why?" Sophie chose the truth that wouldn't hurt. "Because adults think being serious keeps things from breaking." Emma frowned. "Does it?" Sophie shook her head. "No, it just makes the breaking quieter." Emma absorbed that. Then she pushed her plate back fully. "I'll eat later." Sophie nodded. "Okay. No pressure, no battle." Rule 3. Don't turn sadness into a fight. Andrew called at exactly 3:17. Sophie answered on the second ring. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," Sophie replied. "Emma says she's heart not hungry." Andrew exhaled softly. "That sounds like her." "She'll eat later." "I trust you," Andrew said without hesitation. The words startled Sophie more than they should have. "I'll be home at 5, he added. "Traffic." Sophie smiled slightly. "Traffic ruins lives." Andrew paused. "You too?" Sophie caught herself. "Sorry, joke." Andrew's voice warmed just a fraction. It was a good one. The line went quiet before disconnecting. Sophie stared at the phone for a second longer than necessary. Trust was dangerous. At 4:42, Emma sat on the living room floor coloring. Sophie folded laundry nearby. Emma held up a drawing. "Is this purple or blue?" Sophie leaned closer. "It's both." Emma frowned. "That's not how colors work." Sophie smiled. "It is if you're tired." Emma nodded solemnly. "Dad is both." Sophie froze. Emma didn't notice. "He's loud outside," Emma continued, coloring hard. "Quiet inside." Sophie swallowed. "That's very observant," Emma shrugged. "Mom said I noticed too much." Sophie folded a small sweater. "Did your mom mind?" Emma shook her head. "She said noticing means caring." Sophie felt something ache behind her ribs. At 4:59, the front door opened. Andrew stepped inside like someone easing into water, careful not to disturb what might already be fragile. Emma was on her feet immediately. "Dad!" Andrew dropped his bag and opened his arms. Emma ran into them. Sophie looked away, giving them the privacy they didn't ask for but deserved. Andrew rested his chin briefly on Emma's head, eyes closing for half a second too long. Then he noticed Sophie. "She was good," Emma announced proudly. "She didn't fight me." Andrew smiled faintly. "That's impressive," Emma added. "She knows about heart hunger." Andrew looked at Sophie, surprised. "You explained that?" Sophie nodded. She explained it to herself. Andrew studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you." They stood there, the three of them, in a quiet triangle. Something almost like normal hovered nearby. Dinner was simple. Emma ate more than Sophie expected. Andrew noticed. He didn't comment. Afterward, Emma retreated upstairs with her rabbit. Andrew stayed in the kitchen, loosening his tie like it had been holding him hostage all day. "You didn't have to stay late," he said. Sophie shrugged. "I wanted to." Andrew's eyes lifted. "You keep saying that." Sophie met his gaze. "I mean it." A beat. Andrew leaned against the counter. "Diane stopped by the office." Sophie felt her shoulders tighten. "She likes to check in," Andrew continued, tone neutral but weary. Sophie nodded. "She does that." Andrew studied her carefully. "You're not intimidated by her?" Sophie chose her words. "I've met louder people." Andrew smiled once. "Just once." "I believe that." Silence stretched, not awkward, heavy. "Why this job?" Andrew asked suddenly. There it was. Sophie had known the question would come. She kept her voice steady. "I needed something stable." Andrew watched her face. "That's not the whole truth." Sophie didn't deny it. "No." Andrew nodded, respecting the boundary instead of pushing it. "I won't ask you to explain," he said, "but I need honesty with Emma." Sophie met his gaze. "You'll have it." Andrew held her eyes for a moment longer, like he was measuring the weight of that promise. Then Emma's voice floated down the stairs. "Dad?" Andrew turned instantly. "Yes?" "Can Sophie read tonight?" Sophie's breath caught. Andrew glanced at her. "You don't have to." Sophie heard herself say, "I'd like to." Andrew nodded. "Okay." Emma appeared at the top of the stairs, smiling for real this time. Andrew looked at Sophie again, quieter. "Thank you." Later, Sophie sat on the edge of Emma's bed, book in hand. Emma curled under the blanket. "Dad used to read," Emma murmured. "But sometimes he forgets." Sophie opened the book. "I can remind him." Emma yawned. "Don't." Sophie smiled softly. "Okay." She read slowly, letting the words breathe. Emma's eyelids fluttered. Just before sleep took her, Emma whispered, "Sophie?" "Yes?" "Are you going to disappear?" Sophie's chest tightened. "No," she said gently. "I'll tell you if I ever have to leave." Emma nodded, trusting her completely. That trust burned. Sophie turned off the lamp and stood quietly in the doorway. Andrew was there. He hadn't meant to listen, but he had. "She doesn't ask that anymore," Andrew said quietly. Sophie looked at him. "She needed to." Andrew nodded. "I think so." They stood there, the dim light outlining them. Andrew's voice dropped. "She likes you." Sophie's voice was barely a whisper. "I like her too." Andrew swallowed. "That matters." Sophie nodded. She turned to leave. Andrew stopped her gently. "Sophie." She looked back. "Thank you," he said again, "for today." Sophie forced a small smile. "You're welcome." She walked down the hallway toward her bag. Her phone buzzed again. Dad. She didn't open it. Not yet. Because every hour in this house made the truth heavier. And Sophie was starting to understand something dangerous. If she stayed, someone would get hurt, and it might not be the man she came here for. Sophie began to notice how Andrew moved through the house. Not the big things, the small ones. The way he checked the lock twice before going to bed. The way he paused outside Emma's door every night, listening. The way he always waited an extra second before turning off the lights, as if something might change if he gave it time. Those were not habits of a careless man. They were habits of someone afraid to miss something important again. On Wednesday morning, Emma refused to put on her shoes. "I don't want to go," she said flatly, sitting on the stairs. Andrew crouched in front of her, voice calm but tired. "Emma, it's a school day." Emma crossed her arms. "I know." Sophie stood a few steps back, watching. Andrew tried again. "You like school." Emma shook her head. "I like home." Andrew inhaled slowly, the way he did when frustration knocked quietly instead of barging in. Sophie stepped closer. "Can I try something?" she asked. Andrew glanced at her, then nodded. "Please." Sophie crouched in front of Emma, matching her posture instead of correcting it. "Do you want to wear the blue shoes or the yellow ones?" Sophie asked. Emma frowned. "That's not fair." Sophie nodded. "It's not. But it's real." Emma hesitated, then pointed. "Blue." Sophie helped her slide them on. Andrew watched, something unreadable crossing his face. At the door, Emma suddenly hugged Sophie's waist, hard. Sophie froze for half a second, then rested her hand gently on Emma's back. "I'll be here," Sophie said quietly. Emma pulled away and nodded like that was enough. Andrew stood there after the door closed, keys in hand. "You didn't argue?" he said. Sophie shrugged. She wasn't fighting. She was afraid. Andrew looked down. "I should have known." Sophie's voice was gentle. "You did. You just didn't know what to do with it." Andrew nodded once. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. "Coffee?" he asked. Sophie blinked. "Before you leave?" "Yes." They stood at the counter, quiet again. Andrew poured 2 cups. "You're good with her," he said. Sophie stared into the coffee. "She's easy to care about." Andrew looked at her carefully. "You choose your words very carefully." Sophie met his gaze. "So do you." Andrew smiled faintly. "Fair." He grabbed his coat, then paused. "Sophie, if this job ever becomes too much—" "I'll tell you," she said quickly. Andrew nodded. "Okay." He left. Sophie stood alone in the kitchen, coffee cooling in her hands. Her phone buzzed again. "Dad." She opened the message this time. "Did you get the job?" Sophie closed her eyes. "Yes." "And I don't know how to survive it." She didn't reply. That afternoon, Diane Parker arrived without knocking. Sophie opened the door to find her perfectly composed, eyes already scanning the interior like a ledger. "Hello," Diane said smoothly. "You must be Sophie." "Yes." Diane stepped inside. "I wanted to see how Emma was adjusting." Sophie kept her voice calm. "She's doing well." Diane smiled thinly. "Andrew tends to exaggerate stability." Sophie met her gaze. "Children usually do better when adults don't." Diane's eyebrow lifted. "Interesting perspective." Emma appeared at the top of the stairs. "Dad's not home," she announced. Diane's smile sharpened. "I know." Emma didn't come down. Sophie shifted slightly, protective without meaning to be. Diane noticed. "You're very present," Diane said. It's my job." Diane nodded slowly. "And why this family?" There it was again. Sophie answered carefully. It felt right. Diane studied her face like she was reading fine print. "You should be careful," Diane said lightly. "Andrew is complicated," Sophie smiled politely. "So is everyone worth knowing." Diane paused, then laughed softly. "You're not what I expected," Sophie replied just as softly. "Neither are you." Diane turned toward the door. "I'll see myself out," she said. "Tell Andrew I stopped by." Sophie nodded. When the door closed, Emma crept down the stairs. "She smells like fake flowers," Emma whispered. Sophie laughed quietly. "That's very specific." Emma shrugged. "She makes Dad quiet." Sophie's chest tightened. "Yes, she does." That night Andrew came home later than usual. Emma was already asleep. Sophie waited by the door. "Everything okay?" Andrew asked. "Yes," Sophie replied. "And Diane came by." Andrew's shoulders stiffened. "I'm sorry." "She didn't stay long." Andrew nodded, then hesitated. "She didn't upset Emma?" "No." Andrew exhaled. "Good." They stood there, neither quite ready to leave the moment. Andrew spoke first. "You don't scare easily." Sophie met his gaze. "I grew up learning when to stand still." Andrew watched her closely. "Your father?" The word landed heavy. "Yes." Andrew nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. "I'm glad you're here," he said quietly. Sophie's heart skipped. She forced herself to step back. "Good night, Andrew." "Good night, Sophie." She left with her bag over her shoulder, the weight of everything pressing down. In her car, Sophie finally replied to her father's message. "Yes, I got it." 3 dots appeared immediately. "Good. Maybe this one will be different." Sophie stared at the screen. Maybe it will be worse. She drove home in silence, and for the first time since accepting the job, Sophie allowed herself to feel the full truth. She was no longer just observing this family. She was becoming part of it. And when the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't be clean. It would cost something, maybe everything. The first time Sophie noticed it, it was insignificant. Andrew reached for a mug in the cabinet at the same moment she did. Their fingers brushed, just barely. Andrew pulled back instantly, like the contact had burned. "Sorry," he said too quickly. Sophie smiled, small and careful. "It's okay." But the space between them shifted, not louder, heavier. Emma noticed before either of them did. That afternoon, Sophie was helping Emma with a puzzle on the living room floor when Emma suddenly stopped. She looked up at Sophie, then toward the kitchen where Andrew stood pretending not to listen. "You like my dad," Emma said flatly. Sophie froze. Andrew turned at the sink. Emma shrugged. "You're nicer when he's home." Sophie swallowed. "That's not—" Andrew stepped in gently. "Emma, that's not something we say." Emma frowned. "Why?" Andrew hesitated. Because it was too true to dismiss. Because it was too dangerous to explain. Sophie intervened softly. "It's okay to notice things," she said, "but sometimes we don't need to say them out loud." Emma considered this. "Like when Dad pretends he's fine?" Andrew closed his eyes. Sophie felt the weight of the moment settle in her chest. "Yes," Sophie said quietly, "like that." Emma nodded, satisfied, and went back to her puzzle. Andrew stared at Sophie, something unguarded in his eyes. "Children are inconveniently honest," he said. Sophie smiled faintly. "They don't know what we're afraid of yet." Andrew exhaled. "I wish I didn't either." That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the house too quiet even from her apartment across town. She thought of Emma's question, "You like my dad." She thought of Andrew's laugh, rare and soft, the way he listened, the way he never raised his voice. She thought of her father, the letter, the signature, Andrew Miller. Sophie sat up and reached for her phone. "Dad." She called. It rang twice before he answered. "Sophie?" His voice sounded older than she remembered. "I'm working for him," she said without preamble. Silence. Then a breath. "I know," her father said. Her heart slammed. "What?" "I recognized the name," he continued quietly. "I didn't want to stop you." Sophie's voice trembled. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Her father hesitated. "Because I didn't want you carrying my anger." Sophie laughed bitterly. "I already am." "No," he said gently. "You're carrying your own." Tears blurred her vision. "He ruined you," she whispered. Her father sighed. "No. Losing the job hurt. What ruined me was how long I let it define me." Sophie's chest tightened painfully. "You were fired," she said. "You lost everything." "Yes," he replied, "but not because of him alone." Her grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean?" "The decision came from the board," her father said. "Andrew fought it. I heard it later." Sophie's breath caught. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I was ashamed," her father admitted. "I wanted a villain. It was easier than accepting my mistakes." Sophie closed her eyes. "So you let me hate him." Her father's voice broke slightly. "I let you believe what you needed to survive." Sophie ended the call after they said goodnight. She sat in the dark for a long time. The truth didn't feel like relief. It felt like grief, rearranging itself. The next morning, Sophie arrived early, earlier than usual. Andrew opened the door, surprised. "Everything okay?" he asked. Sophie nodded. "Yes, I just needed to be here." Andrew stepped aside. "Coffee?" "Yes," she said. They stood at the counter closer than before. Sophie's heart pounded. She looked at Andrew. "I owe you an apology," she said. Andrew frowned. "For what?" "For judging you without knowing you." Andrew's gaze softened. "We all do that." Sophie shook her head. "No, I came here with reasons." Andrew stilled. Sophie swallowed. "I thought you ruined my father." Silence stretched between them. Andrew didn't interrupt. "I was wrong," Sophie continued, "and I'm sorry." Andrew's voice was low. "Thank you for telling me." "You're not angry?" Andrew looked at her carefully. "I understand anger born from loss." Sophie nodded. "I don't know what happens now," she whispered. Andrew met her gaze. "We take it one honest step at a time." Emma's footsteps echoed from upstairs. "Dad?" Andrew turned. "I'm here." Emma appeared and stopped when she saw them standing close. She smiled knowingly. Sophie stepped back slightly. Andrew noticed, and gently didn't let her. He said quietly, only for Sophie, "Don't disappear." Sophie's breath caught. "I won't," she said. And for the first time since she'd entered that house, Sophie believed it might be true. That evening, Sophie decided to leave. Not forever, but before it became impossible. She packed her bag slowly. Emma watched from the doorway. "We are leaving," Emma said. Sophie nodded. "Just for the night." Emma crossed the room and hugged her tightly. "You promised," Emma whispered. Sophie hugged back. "I know." Andrew appeared behind Emma. He looked at Sophie like he was bracing himself. "You don't have to go," he said. Sophie met his eyes. "I do," she replied softly, "because staying right now would be a lie." Andrew nodded. "I'll be here," he said. Emma looked between them, confused but trusting. "Tomorrow?" Emma asked. Sophie smiled through the ache. "Tomorrow." As Sophie walked out, Andrew followed her to the door. He stopped her gently. "Sophie?" She turned. "If you ever choose to stay," he said quietly, "make sure it's because you want to, not because you feel you owe us." Sophie nodded, tears slipping free. "I promise." She left, and the house breathed again. But something essential had already shifted, because love had entered the room, and it doesn't leave quietly. Sophie didn't sleep that night. Not because she was afraid, because clarity can be louder than fear. She lay in bed replaying Andrew's words. "Make sure it's because you want to." For the first time in years, no one was asking her to choose sides. No one was asking her to carry someone else's anger. Just truth. And truth, she was learning, demanded action. The next morning, Sophie didn't arrive early. She arrived exactly on time. Andrew opened the door and paused, like he'd been waiting for the sound of her steps. "Good morning," he said carefully. "Good morning," Sophie replied. Neither of them moved. Emma's voice came from the living room. "Sophie?" Sophie smiled. "I'm here." Emma ran toward her and stopped short, suddenly unsure. Sophie knelt. "I came back because I wanted to," she said gently. Emma studied her face, then nodded once. "Okay." Andrew watched the exchange, something like relief settling in his chest. The day unfolded differently, not heavier, clearer. Andrew worked from home, moving between calls and quiet moments. Sophie and Emma baked pancakes. Real ones, flour everywhere. Emma laughed so hard she had to sit on the floor. Andrew appeared in the doorway, stunned. "You're breaking all the rules," he said. Emma grinned. "They're better rules." Andrew looked at Sophie. "She's right, isn't she?" Sophie smiled. "Yes." They ate together, not like a performance, like people who were learning again. In the afternoon, Diane Parker arrived unannounced. Andrew didn't let her inside. "Sophie's here," Diane said smoothly. "I know what you thought," Andrew replied, "and I'm asking you to leave." Diane's smile tightened. "You're letting a nanny make decisions now?" Andrew's voice was calm. "I'm letting myself." Diane's gaze flicked past him, catching Sophie at the hallway edge. "This isn't over," Diane said. Andrew nodded. "No, it's just clearer now." He closed the door. Emma watched, wide-eyed. "Dad?" Andrew knelt in front of her. "Sometimes adults need to protect their homes," he said. "Not from danger, from noise." Emma nodded seriously. "I don't like noise." Andrew smiled. "Neither do I." That night Sophie prepared to leave again. But slower this time, Andrew stood beside her at the door. "You don't have to decide everything today," he said. Sophie met his gaze. "I know." They stood close, closer than they had before. Andrew reached out, then stopped himself. Sophie closed the distance instead. Their kiss was not rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was careful, honest, chosen. When they pulled back, Andrew rested his forehead against hers. "I don't want to scare Emma," he whispered. "You won't," Sophie replied. "We'll be honest." Andrew nodded. Inside, Emma peeked around the corner. She smiled. Weeks later, the house sounded different. Laughter stayed longer. Silence felt less sharp. Sophie still left at night. Andrew still checked the locks, but they no longer held their breath. One evening, Emma placed her drawing on the table. The stick figures were there. Dad, me, and now, Sophie. Emma looked up. "I didn't replace Mom," she said seriously. "I added." Sophie's eyes filled. Andrew squeezed her hand. "Yes," he said. "You added." Sophie looked at them both. At the family they weren't planning, at the love they chose anyway, and for the first time, the past loosened its grip. Because the future had finally asked her to stay. If this story stayed with you, you're not alone. Stories like this are made for people who still believe in connection, in second chances, and in choosing love, imperfectly, bravely, honestly. If you feel that too, this space is for you. If this story touched you in any way, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribing helps this space grow and allows us to keep sharing stories like this, stories about love, healing, and choices that change everything. And before you go, tell us in the comments, how did this story make you feel? Your voice matters here.